Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our SB 671 work group. My name is Hannah Walter. I work for the California Transportation Commission. So before we go over today's agenda, let me have Cherry give some basic instructions for the webinar. Go ahead, Cherry.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the SB 671 work group meeting. For participants joining us through GoToWebinar, please find the webinar panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. There you will find the audio question and handout tabs. The meeting agenda is located under the handouts tab and can be downloaded and saved during the webinar. It can also be found on the Commission's website. As a reminder, each registered attendee is provided a unique link and phone number to access the webinar. These cannot be shared with other participants as they are registered to each specific attendee. There are two options for all of you to provide comments or feedback during this workshop. The first option is to raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon. This will indicate to us that you wish to speak. At the appropriate time between slides or after the presentations, CTC staff will unmute you so that you can provide your comment. The other option is to use the questions tab. Click on questions and there will be a box to type in your comment. At the appropriate time after a presentation, CTC staff will read your comment to the rest of the group. Thank you for joining us today, and we appreciate you sharing your time and feedback with us.
Thanks, Cherry. So what we have on our agenda today are two items. The first is a presentation from Nico Bokamp from the California Fuel Cell Partnership, and he's going to talk about a potential methodology for prioritizing hydrogen station locations, and we want to get your feedback on that. And the second one is from Mikel Scarla from the Workgroup Group. Mikel is the Senior Government Affairs Advisor for the Workgroup Group, and he is going to be talking about information from the perspective of the California Hydrogen Coalition, which was founded to enable California's transition to zero-emission vehicles by expanding the availability of reliable, convenient, and affordable hydrogen fueling. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from both of them, and I appreciate their flexibility in presenting today. And I really like that this group, offers input and has really good points that you always bring up. I think logistically, just for the sake of time, after about 8 minutes or so of questions, I'm going to move on to the second presentation. So just keep that in mind. But without further ado, here's Nico. Hi, Nico.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I assume you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, good. I just unmuted. I was already talking, but I realized on time that I was not off mute. So good morning, everyone, assuming that you're all here on the West Coast. To talk a little bit about how we could go about prioritizing station locations for heavy-duty hydrogen stations in the state of California and possibly outside of that as well. We have some experience with that, going through the exercise with that on light-duty vehicles. I realize that's not directly transferable, that experience, because obviously truck fueling and retail car fueling is a little different, are pretty significantly different worlds. So I'm just mentioning here a few items that are worth considering, and these are just some variables that you'd often see in a lot of documents when it's about station locations for hydrogen station or for charger location for that matter. We did publish a heavy-duty truck vision for 2035, and that document also mentions a number of station density areas. And the reason for mentioning station density areas is because this process of selecting specific locations takes quite a lot of effort. It involves both industry and government, and on the industry side, a variety of stakeholders as well. It could be truck manufacturers, could be fleet operators, shippers, could include infrastructure providers or truck stop operators, and also investors and possibly folks that have jurisdiction in some of these regions, say, for example, highway-related matters, and some of the agencies that are involved on this call. So this is an overview of some of the variables, but let me now get to maybe a more practical approach and how these things relate, how these items relate to each other. And one note before we move on to the next slide: type of fuel. The reason that has type of fuel in there is because for hydrogen there are two pressures currently used for heavy duty. That's 350 bar, mostly used for transit, but also for drayage applications, and 700 bar, which is really the need at the moment for longer haul operations, including long haul in the future. So what could be an approach, and keep in mind this is an approach. This is not the approach that I'm talking about here, but this is more so to stir your thinking on this topic and try to get some structure to it and some thinking on how the process could go about. And Hannah's already done some work in this area, which she has shared previously. Either I don't know if you've presented on all the details, but you've been distributing some documents on some of the work you've been doing, which is also thought-provoking. First of all, you could go about by identifying critical locations. When I talk about that, I'll expand on that a little bit later on, but identify critical locations could be like by focusing on, for example, ports as anchors to start the rollout of an infrastructure, because that's a shorter haul. Regionally, it addresses challenges that ports are dealing with regard to emissions, and it also addresses a sort of captive fleet. They do operate elsewhere in a lot of cases, and that's the challenge with Class 8 trucks. They don't necessarily stay near the area where they're typically operating, but say like 5% of their routes may consist of going all the way to Phoenix instead of staying in the LA metro area or staying in the San Francisco Bay Area. They go elsewhere and outside the borders of California as well. So then when you have, like, say, kind of anchor locations, regions, you could go identify connections between those areas. And I don't know if you hear my background noise. Just give me 1 second. I'm back. Apologies for that. I don't know if that was, if people heard that, but the vacuum cleaning just outside my door, which I heard very well. Don't know. I hope you didn't. So, so to connect these anchors, you identify connections between those areas, important, so you can make sure that those two areas can connect to each other. So port to port freight movement could happen, as well as in regions that are in between those areas that are feeding those ports, for example, or they're fed by the ports, because there's import and there's export. Then you go and look at what the coverage is. You have to make sure of that as well when you look at the anchor regions. So make sure the region is covered, a sufficient infrastructure. So if one station is, for example, down, then there's a backup. That's another item: redundancy in a network. So coverage, redundancy, but then also capacity. So you want to make sure along your connections, as well as in your anchor region, that you have capacity to provide fuel to those trucks. We often take that for granted because liquid fuels that we currently have, the conventional fuels, there's plenty or copious amounts of storage, can be stored underground and easily stored, but it does have very significant environmental impacts, and that's what we're looking at here, to transition to zero emission vehicle technology and fuels that can serve that in an appropriate way, so there are no tailpipe emissions, not tailpipe emissions. And then there are a number of other criteria, for example, economical reasons or permitting challenges. So if you move on to the next slide. I mentioned some of these items already. What critical locations could be: ports. I mentioned those, so I think we don't need to expand on that. But then there are also intermodal rail yards, which are sometimes closer to the ports, but not always. They could also exist elsewhere, farther inland, or elsewhere. LA is an example of that, where intermodal rail yards are not immediately adjacent to the port. That's why 710 corridor, for example, exists, as well as in the Inland Empire, where there are several large rail yards. And then the warehouse districts, they could be spread throughout the region. It's the same for both San Francisco as well as the LA region, but there are also warehouse districts in other regions as well. And there are also concepts under development, such as inland ports, where rail would connect an inland region to a port to address the number of trucks moving around, and then basically moving the or reducing the emissions by making sure that trucks drive instead of stand still and idle, for example. So and not create additional congestion, which also results in more emissions. Then there are the air cargo locations. Then there are a number of other locations. What we've not mentioned here is, like, say, production centers, although this typically go hand in hand with warehouse districts. So let's move on to the next slide. Yeah, this is an item, the connections. So there's connector stations, station locations. You want to choose corridors that have significant traffic, even though in the end you need to have coverage as well. So this is an initial target. Later on, this kind of diminishes a little bit when there's more fueling infrastructure available, but this is still an important item. So let's move on to the next slide. Some of the other criteria that's more in the economical realm. So you could focus on, for example, on existing truck stops. The reason why that is because the permitting is in place. It's a known location with regard to existing logistics and operational cycles of truck fleet operators, and they typically have space as well for infrastructure, or have to be willing to facilitate, but they typically do have space for hosting, for example, hydrogen to be added to their site. Also, there has been some conversation about including light duty locations. The challenge with that is that they are really not designed and laid out for hosting heavy duty truck fueling. It has to do with ingress, egress, has to do with space, has to do with canopy height, being confined by, or not intentionally probably, but by housing, for example, that's adjacent to a light duty fueling site. So that typically is a topic that is an exception that may work economically in some cases, but it should not be the rule, because heavy duty fueling typically happens elsewhere than in light duty locations for mentioned reasons, but also for some other reasons. And then the proximity to freeways, that's typically where trucks move and are filled with fuel, and then they can go about their business and transport the freight where it needs to go. So you can choose, like, would you want it to be within a certain distance, but that should not be too complicated, because the existing fueling infrastructure and movement of trucks typically focuses on the corridors. And then also it's depending on what the impact would be on residents or disadvantaged populations. However, a hydrogen alternative emission-wise is wouldn't say 100% improvement, but let's say because there is still movement of trucks, but emission-wise it's an enormous improvement with regards to fumes and emissions and noise, etc., because there is little to no noise for hydrogen fueling stations. Next slide. So I think at this point, Hannah, it's up to you if you want to host questions, or if you want to transition to Mick and then afterwards do questions for the whole group.
Let's take some time to respond to questions on your presentation, and then we can move to the next one. So Sherry,
yes,
yeah.
We do have one written question, and it's from James Schenkel of Caltrans. What has been the experience with existing truck stop facilities being receptive to bringing hydrogen fueling into their operations? What concerns have they raised?
Like the question. It's a little forward-looking in the sense of that there are a few hydrogen fuel cell trucks out there, as well as battery electric heavy-duty trucks. there is a significant interest in this, and that's because these trucks need a decent amount of fuel, whereas a lot of other alternatives do not require that. And the reason it's the interest is not publicly known is also because the truck rules are still in the early stages of implementation. I see the question right now. Concerns are pretty typical. It's like, is this economically viable? Is this going to hold up over time? What do we need to think about? Setback distances come in. It's a whole different set of requirements that comes in compared to diesel fuel, where you, and I'm simplifying this, plop a tank under the ground, put a pipe on it, and connect a dispenser to it. And then underground means that it can basically, it doesn't take up space. With regards to above ground operations, and operations just continue over the, basically on top of the tank, over the top surface, and so it's relatively simple. Whereas for zero emission fuels, you do have to think about space needed for above ground equipment, fuel storage, and setback distances related to that. And those setback distances are really to make sure that safety is warranted and can be managed. Let's say it that way, because as with different with other fuels, there's a lot of there is some worry about that, but typically that is not as significant as it is with light duty, because of the environment of truck stops are different. There already is a raised level of awareness about safety because of the movement of very heavy vehicles, and you don't really want to walk around there in that sense. So there are some concerns that have been raised, but have been typically addressed. But it's also like there are only 3 truck stations operational at the moment. They're all in the LA region, all operated by Shell in Ontario, Wilmington, and in Long Beach. And to my knowledge, that went better than it went, or went better is a big word, I guess in this case. It was good. It was manageable because there had been experience with implementing hydrogen at light duty retail stations, which is a very confined space, small footprint, lots of concerns potentially raised by residents around it about an unknown fuel, as well as at different levels of city government. So this is a different environment, and it's more understood, and it's more comprehensive, I would say, the awareness about safety. So a little long-winded answer, but I think I touched on most of the items that should be mentioned here.
We have another written question or comment. This is from Aravind Kailas with Volvo Group of North America. We as an industry need to work together to develop the right messaging when it comes to H2. For example, a lot of warehousing fleets are already taking battery electric trucks. They shouldn't get confused and feel this is the next fad. There's a place for H2 in battery electric products, and we need to ensure they complement one another as much as possible. So that's a comment.
Sounds more like a comment. And hi, Arvind, good to have you on the call as well. And I fully agree on that. This is, in my mind, kind of an all hands on deck kind of situation with regard to the targets for heavy duty trucks, or for trucks overall. There is so much work to be done. Both battery electric and fuel cell electric have a place, and there is an opportunity for both of them. And aside from that, fuel cell electric is also reliant on battery electric because it's a hybrid technology. So they're both electric drives. So there is mostly a difference in the way they're fueled.
And then we have another question or comment. This is from Tom Martin. I understand the bigger issue with hydrogen has to do with the availability of renewable, I lost it here. I understand the bigger issue with hydrogen has to do with availability of renewable power production. Much of renewable power production is already spoken for via pre-negotiated PPAs.
Yes and no. The challenge with transitioning the world of transportation to, say, electricity and hydrogen is that there is not really much capacity to start with. So let's say you're starting off at 0 for transportation fuel, for trucking. All new capacity needs to have production capacity to back it up with. So for hydrogen, PPAs will also be agreed on and capacity will be implemented. And that's the same for electricity. The thing is with transportation fuels in the state of California specifically, for hydrogen, the renewable content is measured at the nozzle. So if you dispense hydrogen, there needs to be a certain amount of renewable content. And so far that's been outdone. The requirement is 33%, that's the minimum, but under LCFS, I think it's 40%. Currently, the light duty network has been able to get into the high 90s with regards to renewable content, and that's all credited. On the electrical side, the hope is that there will be a similar structure because any new power used basically for transportation fuel needs to meet that requirement that there's renewable content. So that's if everything is already spoken for elsewhere in the electrical grid by other uses, then that needs to be new capacity as well. So I would say both hydrogen as well as electricity as a fuel have that same challenge. I don't see that as a concern solely focused on hydrogen, but it's an overall zero emission vehicle transportation fuel challenge.
I think we have one more question from Amber Rivera. What type of hydrogen is being considered? Gray, blue, or green hydrogen?
Well, good question. I think I addressed that earlier, but let me repeat it just for sake of answering the question directly. California has a renewable content requirement. So blue hydrogen, and the color wheel is kind of like not so defined, but I think I got the gist of it. Basically means there's carbon capture happening in the process. That's not really happening right now, so that's more of a future under development kind of option. So let's consider like gray and green, also undefined at this point, although I think the general conception is that gray hydrogen comes from natural gas. As I said, California has specific requirements for renewable content in hydrogen as a fuel, as a transportation fuel. Therefore, hydrogen in all cases will be at least 30 to 40% renewable. So that moves towards partially green, partially gray, and the current light duty network, as I said, is like in the high 90s with regards to greenness, if you want to put it in color. So there's really no option to go with all gray for that matter, or all blue, because the requirements don't allow for that to happen. And also the current work that's being done from an economic perspective and self-sufficiency and sustainability perspective is that there is a high potential, and that's being worked on very hard right now, and it appears to be working out so far, is that green has a significant opportunity to see a lot of cost reduction with volume of throughputs, and trucking will help out with that in addition to light duty. So the expectation is that the majority of it will be green, and also know that industry has a 2030 goal to have all decarbonized, 100% decarbonized hydrogen. So that could include blue hydrogen, but the majority of that will be addressed with green hydrogen. So hopefully that's it's a little bit of a, again, longer answer than maybe expected.
Hannah, I don't see any hands raised or any additional commenters. We can.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks. And we should transition soon, but do you mind if I just ask you one question?
Go ahead.
So I think that it makes sense to look at truck stops as potential hydrogen locations because they, like you were saying, you know, they're already in close proximity to the freeway and they might be more likely to have the space that it would be needed. So that makes sense to do you think that there's because I think I mentioned before on the call that when I thought of hydrogen, I usually thought of like long haul, and when I thought of electric, I usually thought of the shorter trips. Is that an accurate perspective? Like, you think hydrogen is especially useful for like certain use cases, or do you think it's more like it could be beneficial for any type of use case? Because I'm trying to think about when we're looking at stations to prioritize and where, just what that is, going to look like.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in your question, actually, the concept that you touched on. I would say that is partially true in the sense of that's currently appears to be the case. However, it depends a little bit on the willingness of the fleet operator and the people operating the trucks, because there are fleets that are largely focused on long haul, but they also have regional haul or short haul operations, so they may consider a mix of the two technologies. But then also, it depends on what their flexibility is with regard to the time, and this is a little bit futuristic looking, because obviously there are not a lot of trucks on the road, so we have to see how it all works out with regards to the mix of the two technologies. Yeah, it really comes down to how much time can truck operators deal with time taken for fueling. In the case of hydrogen, it's very focused on the one-to-one, so basically a similar experience as diesel fueling, time-wise, and that's a challenge for charging. But then on the other hand, charging electrical grid is available on more places, maybe not at capacity, but you could maybe muster like an overnight charge. So at this point, that may be a good option, and that may be a good option in the longer term as well. So it's kind of like, yes, but there's a lot more to it. I don't know if that really addresses your question, but I would keep an open mind with regards to technologies, and I would say hydrogen, it can be used in both applications, batteries too, but you do have to think about the time it takes. So it's a mix of the two. So always keep an open mind of like a mix of the two, and more so of a what's the ratio in each case of in each fleet's situation, basically.
Okay, that's a good point. So you're saying it's more like it's going to depend more on the business case for the fleet by fleet type of decision of how they're really going to look at that. But we need infrastructure to support both. So
yeah, I would say what hydrogen infrastructure has more of an opportunity for capacity in fewer locations, and fill more trucks. But even in that case, so when you focus on the ports, you have a good example of that. The challenge is also in both cases, more so for charging, is like, is there enough space to facilitate it? And I think we've had that conversation in previous calls that you've hosted. Is there enough space to facilitate these trucks? Because you're not just talking about just a tractor, but you may be talking about the whole combination of a tractor and a trailer. So you're looking at lots of space for to host charging. So yeah, it's again a mix of things, but I would say focus on the port to get things started there, and then you can start looking at like distancing things to connect regions and go farther out, for example, to other states along corridors.
okay, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. Well, thank you, Nico. I really appreciate it. And can you put or Cherry, can you put Nico's email in the chat? Do you mind if we do that, Nico, in case people want to reach out to you directly?
No, that's fine. Go ahead, and maybe you want to mention both of my email addresses just in case I miss one of them. I think you have both of them.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, we will do.
Yes, we'll do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Mikhail, are you ready?
Yeah, can you, is my camera on? There we go.
Oh, there you are. Hi.
Well, thanks. Should I just kick into the presentation?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so Mikhail Skavarla with Workgroup Group here on behalf of the California Hydrogen Coalition. just wanted to do a bit of a disclaimer because we are in early days and a lot is happening and changing in our space. There are protocols that are driving some significant advancement throughout the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles fleet and refueling stations. So, we're kind of using this as a proxy and a early set of information based on our light duty experience to project out some of the insights without disclosing too much confidential information from the station developers that comprise the California Hydrogen Coalition. Currently today, all of the heavy duty stations that have been built by one of our members, and we represent about 80% of the light duty refueling market as well. Includes heavy duty truck OEMs as well as light duty vehicle OEMs and 2 of the major industrial gas companies in the state that are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in additional renewable hydrogen production. So we can go on to the next slide. So in terms of foundational policy needs, at this point in time, hydrogen is representative of less than 3% of the state funds on zero emission vehicle infrastructure, largely due to the fact that most of the settlements, publicly and investor-owned utility investments, as well as a big portion of the state funds, have been designated to charging, which is somewhat more expeditious to get off the ground, especially with the return to base and at-home charging options. To that end, as in the 21-22 budget and the proposed 22 and 23 budget, there's substantial amount of unallocated funding right now, is about $3 billion in terms of funding that hasn't been allocated. And if that was to be equitably distributed, we have the opportunity to get the 200 stations envisioned in the Fuel Cell Partnerships heavy duty vision document, which would provide a network of heavy duty refueling that could serve the entire state and almost all the heavy medium duty and the heavy duty fleets. And we're within our group, we kind of bifurcate medium duty as it's not a perfect thing. Class 3 and below will most likely use the light duty network, though the light duty network can serve up to class 5 or 6, depending on the size of the vehicle. That being said, it kind of throws off our daily fueling capacity and things like that. And so, we expect kind of that heavier medium duty fleet, class 5, 6, 7, and 8, when we get to the heavy, to be using these larger stations that are most likely at truck stops or behind card lock. So to that end, we're kind of behind in terms of funding and dedicated funding, and to that end, that's an important, crucial aspect of getting this early network launched so that we can achieve our advanced clean fleets goals being developed by the Air Resources Board. Additionally, it's very important in these early days to extend within the low carbon fuel standard an additional 2.5% deficit for capacity credits. What this allows us to do is it allows us to build stations with the future in mind. If we're so we're able to build a larger station today with the anticipation of the fleet coming in the near future. There are a number of sideboards and kind of guards that were built into the light duty version of this. And as we proceed through the scoping plan and into the regulatory aspect of the low carbon fuel standard, this is a critically important goal. It also reduces the necessary incentive to build the station, as it allows us to finance for the future and it helps kind of with the capital allocation there. So in terms of cost estimates, we're kind of basing this on the initial light duty utilization or light duty examples. And so the operation of heavy duty can be scaled from what we know of light duty. There's some of the behind the fence stuff is compatible, though there's significant development taking place in the heavy duty space, and there's a new protocol being developed at the national level for these heavy duty refueling nozzles and the trucks themselves. Right now, the energy transfer from light duty nozzle is in the range, it's just under equivalent to a 4 megawatt charger. And so that's 4x what's envisioned for the heavy duty charging sector. And our goal with the heavy duty space is to get up to what would be equivalent to a 12 megawatt charger in terms of energy transfer. And that's another one of those critical benefits of building a hydrogen network is we're going to be a direct one-to-one replacement in terms of operation and operational timing. So productivity remains the same for your fleet once you transfer over to this space. And so today, the equipment cost at a light duty station is about $2 million to $2.5 million, depending on the capacity. That's between 1,200 and 1,600 kilograms per day of nameplate capacity, with the average public match being just around, just slightly over $1 million each. And so to that end, we anticipate the heavy duty stations being at least 5 times as large as a light duty station. And so the initial equipment costs will be around $10 million, so upwards of 15 million if depending on the size, right? And all of this is about right sizing the station for what your anticipated needs will be in the future. And so to that end, you'll have to have grants that are similarly sized, with roughly 50% of the equipment cost being somewhere around $50 million or around $5 million per station. Initially, again, heavy duty HRI crediting through the low carbon fuel standard could potentially lower these costs, but at this time we don't have the insights into that as we haven't built enough of these stations. That being said, your capacity here is substantially, you can't compare that apples to apples with charging, as the energy transfer is so much greater, and the opportunity here to maintain productivity and freight efficiency allows you to utilize your fleet at a higher level than the longer dwell times that would tend to take place in the charging space. And so I think ultimately the appropriate policy signals in the initial launch, which we're experiencing right now in the heavy duty hydrogen space, are necessary. And I think to Nico's end, it's important to get those bookends set first, and then we'll get the connectors in the future. But we see hydrogen in the heavy medium duty and the heavy duty space fulfilling a big role, just mainly on the productivity space, and the aspect to have flexibility within your fleet, especially if you don't know, or your routes are uncertain, or you're using the same trucks for multiple routes throughout the week. And then anything that in heavy duty. And I think the ARB's scoping plan modeling has affirmed that, especially in the heavy duty space. I think we're obviously all waiting to see the assumptions and underlying technical data that went into the E3 pathways model there. But I think a majority of heavy duty will end up being in the hydrogen space. And just kind of on the final thing, when we talk about kind of cost per kilowatt equivalency here, I think that's a really important space to have the conversation, as that's how you would draw your equivalency. And so today, with the 4 megawatt equivalent charger, hydrogen nozzle, in terms of creating equivalency to a charging nozzle, with the cost that the state is paying for both DC fast charging and hydrogen refueling, it's roughly equivalent. We can say that a hydrogen nozzle today provides 10 times the level of energy transfer per minute than the best DC fast charger, at around 5 times the cost or at around 5% of the public cost per kilowatt hour. So it's there's going to be a tremendous kind of conversion here, and ultimately it's the goal with both charging and hydrogen to provide a direct transition away from fossil fuels, and that's what we're trying to compete with. And these early days and early policy signals are absolutely critical and necessary to making sure we can move in that direction. That's what I have, but I did want to kind of follow up on kind of the renewable accounting question, if that's okay.
Yes,
okay.
Definitely.
Yes. So in terms of the statement that all renewable electricity has been accounted for with regards to power purchase agreements, the announcements from the hydrogen production side of the equation have been largely tied to dedicated production of renewables. So Plug Power is building a facility in Mendota that's got its own dedicated solar farm. A lot of the hydrogen stuff, the underlying financing of new renewable projects are being tied to hydrogen production, as we are curtailment has depressed pricing in the renewable sector. And so I think globally we're seeing this need to underpin renewable investments with hydrogen production, as curtailment has become a major issue. And just as a back of the envelope thing, last year California curtailed enough electricity that we could have produced hydrogen to refuel 200,000 vehicles for free for that year. This is energy that is negatively priced or freely grounded and not utilized by the grid. And the duck curve's only going to get bigger as we move towards 100% renewable and clean standard as laid out in SB 100. And so hydrogen in terms of a statewide energy system is absolutely critical and necessary to move in that direction. Also, with regard to the color wheel, it is, as Nico indicated, a bit arbitrary. There are some folks who consider all renewable hydrogen pathways green. And there are some folks who distinguish that between green hydrogen is only electrolytic. And so to that end, I think we prefer to stick within the realm of carbon intensity, which is what the low carbon fuel sender, the signal it sends. And because of the strong signal and the pricing within the low carbon fuel standard, as Nico indicated, the vast majority of the light duty stations are in the high 90s, if not 100% renewable today. And that is, a lot of that is coming from biogas. Some of it is coming from electrolytic. Either way, the carbon intensity is below the grid today. So with all kind of environmental accounting and credibility given to it, the hydrogen that is being delivered to the transportation sector right now today is cleaner than the electricity being delivered from the grid, especially if you're charging between the 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. hours, which is when I think a vast majority of the return to fleet or return to base charging will take place. That time there aren't many zero carbon resources, and there will be less with the drought that is taking place now until we build a sufficient offshore wind and some other zero carbon resources, which I don't think the state's going to permit.
And Mikael, just so I can make sure I understand you for the curtailment point you brought up. Okay, my understanding of curtailment is that it's when there's actually more energy from like solar or wind than what is needed, so we actually scale back generation of those energy sources because we don't want to produce more than what we can use at a point in time, right?
Yeah, and some of the day ahead market stuff may mitigate curtailment in the state of California, but it is when the procured wind and solar is producing more than the grid demand at that time. And in the summer, it's happening traditionally during the middle parts of the day with the grid ramping up in the afternoon and evening for the kind of cooling and for the cooling season. As we procure more renewable electricity to achieve the SB 100 standards, we're creating and exacerbating that overproduction. And so hydrogen provides a great opportunity as a grid service to recover kind of that ratepayer procurement cost in a fuel that could be used either, run it back through a fuel cell and put it back on the grid, or use it as a combustion fuel for peaking plants, but also selling it into the transportation market may be the highest and best value for that unit of energy.
Okay, got it. Because hydrogen by its nature is more flexible about the timing of when you can use the energy, right?
Yeah, and
okay.
With the ability to store it for months at a time without degradation and kind of like we do today and the world does today with natural gas, hydrogen is essentially a zero carbon proxy that can be applied for terms of long duration storage, peaking capacity, and use within the transportation sector.
Thanks. So are you ready for me to open it up to questions from the group? Okay,
Yeah.
great. Sherry, are there any questions?
Yes. So there's a question from James Schenkel. How does grid capacity factor into the nozzle standard, changing from 4 megawatts to 12 megawatts in general and in the context of specific battery electric public fueling locations?
So when I'm talking about 4 megawatts and 12 megawatts, we're talking about the energy delivery equivalency. And so we're not actually impacting the grid as we're talking about the flow rate of hydrogen from the bulk storage at the refueling center or refueling site into the vehicle. And so it's not a grid operation, it's a transfer of hydrogen into a tank. If you were to, because I'm trying to create an equivalency here to charging and what that would be so that folks don't compare a DC fast charger to a hydrogen station, as they're not equivalent in terms of how rapidly they transfer energy, or which is also, you can scale that for cost, dwell time, and other things. So it's not an impact to the grid per se. Our compressors are what are moving that. It's not kind of a charging issue.
Sherry, are there other questions? Yeah.
We had a couple of written questions, but this was going back to Nico's presentation towards the end before we started on this one. So I'll just read them out. I think they're mainly comments, but this is from Tom Martin. The group should not dismiss any technology out of hand. Let the technology evolve with no artificial constraints. Look at all the above and give the market a chance. Keep in mind that strategic regional electrical transmission upgrades are supportive of both hydrogen and electric.
100% agree.
That's a good point. Thank you. Yeah, we don't really have to put any I don't think we need to constrain anything. We should just let the market play out. I agree.
And I think to that end, there's a really low threshold for achieving hydrogen self-sufficiency in terms of when you scale the costs out to a statewide network. And I think Nico touched on that in terms of for far fewer stations, hydrogen can create a much bigger spread. And it's, while the station costs are much bigger, the ability to serve vehicles is actually greater. And in that kind of traditional one-to-one replacement sense. And it's not that one technology is better for others. Each fleet will make that determination based on what their commercial demands are. We just think that this is a great option if you have variable routes, need the freight efficiency, need fast refueling. And so, it's up to individuals to make those determinations. But for the 200 stations, ultimately, I think the state spent over 3.75 billion on charging to date. We've spent less than $260 million on hydrogen. For an additional, I think 1.6 billion, we could have an entire statewide network of light to medium and medium to heavy stations, plus sufficient transit capacity for any transit district that was desirous of going that direction. And so it's, the ultimate end cost to off-ramp hydrogen is much sooner in the horizon than I think it will be for charging.
So this written comment from Tom Martin, what about costs for hydrogen production and conveyance to the station locations, production stations, transmission and distribution lines, and right of way?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think right now the market, is sustaining its own investment. To date, the state of California has put, I think last year's budget has a proposal for 50 million for biomass conversion to liquid fuels and or hydrogen. And then there's a proposal for 100 million for electrolytic. Other than that, the state has not really invested in hydrogen production for the market. And so that's cost being borne by the private sector, and kind of that, upstream side. So when you think about those production costs, these are things that are being borne by the investors in the marketplace and will be, built into the cost per kilogram. That said, on the grid side of things, with charging, all of those investments are being rate-based based on the agreement within SB 100 on the renewable and clean, or SB 350 and SB 100, basically allowed utilities to rate base all of those distribution, make ready type things, so transmission, distribution, all the way up to the stub out on the charger are being borne within your rates. So all Californians are bearing those costs. We've accounted for that in our analysis of kind of current day spending, and I believe the CPUC has dedicated something like 1.5 billion to that to date, and that will continue to escalate over time as more and more of charging is being deployed. Each and every charger has some sort of rate-borne cost into it, whereas on the hydrogen side, the investments in production are being borne by the private sector, and ultimately, will be seen within the cost of the hydrogen. But our goal is obviously by mid-decade to be at parity with the cost of diesel. That's actually looking to be much sooner because of current day fuel prices. And I believe that we're probably at parity today at a number of the stations, especially the stations with liquid storage.
We have a question from Genevieve Giuliano. Any insights on a mixed fleet future? Should California invest in both fueling networks?
Yeah, I absolutely think that the competition is not necessarily will we have charging or will we have hydrogen. We're going to need both. The grid costs just for building electrification and our kind of baseline on transportation have largely kind of been ignored to date, but as we see more and more modeling, and even CAISO's announced the need for $30 billion in grid infrastructure, I think the pace at which we need to decarbonize the transportation sector is going to lend itself to large hydrogen deployment, and I believe the scoping plan is starting to signal that. But there's going to be a mixed fleet, right? If you don't need if you know your routes and you know exactly what that truck or van is going to do on a daily basis, and you've got the ability to charge at your warehouse and or corp yard, then you're probably going to go that direction. But if you have kind of an unknown route, and I'm thinking of the construction fleet, which is my background's originally in construction, you don't know where your job site is week to week. You potentially based in Sacramento, driving to San Jose. And having job site needs as well as getting back home that night, you're probably going to select differently. Or if you're in the long haul space, or if your truck fleet's being leased and those routes are variable, I think you're going to probably choose hydrogen. And with the kind of goal of the federal administration of hydrogen costs, I think it's going to be incredibly competitive as an option for the fleets that want that flexibility and desire that rapid refueling. But I also think that at a certain point, the freight operators, goods movement's fairly sophisticated in this end, and do you need that extra weight in your trailer? And so choosing between the hydrogen truck, which is lighter, and the battery truck, which is heavier, may factor into that and your labor costs. And so it's really going to be mixed. I think right now, ARB is projecting in the light duty space that 25% of the vehicles will be fuel cell, and then kind of as you get into medium duty, it's getting closer to 50-50, and in the heavy duty, it will be more in favor of the hydrogen, and that's just based on vehicles that have to go, have to have shorter dwell times, have to carry more weight, and cannot be easily electrified due to a number of reasons, be it lack of space, lack of the need to keep that truck moving, or they have variable routes and daily usage. Also, the PTO space, the vehicles with power takeoffs, I think will largely move towards hydrogen as well, just for the general needs of that extra energy. Sizing a battery for that kind of 8 to 12 hour shift is not necessarily going to be cost effective or best for utilization.
We have a question from Robert Naylor. How could public agencies best invest in infrastructure to support deployment of hydrogen regionally in Southern California?
How can public agencies invest? Vast majority of the investments to date from public agencies have been within the bus space, and I think that's a good option, especially depending on the terrain and the routes that your bus fleets are running. But our kind of big local issue is permitting. Our permit times tend to run over 500 days, and with kind of advanced clean fleets in mind, the timeline that ARB would like to get these fleets moving and on the road, we're already behind on that 500-day curve right now, if the money were to go out the door. And so it's really necessary that the public gets there. That being said, if there are desires to partner on kind of public fleet stations and things like that, we can put you in touch. But really, a lot of this is being driven by private investment, but we're absolutely open to public-private partnerships on moving things down. And fleets like Sunline have actually, Sunline Transit District, have actually built capacity with having, they've got their behind the fence refueling, and then they've got a public facing side, and they're building additional capacity in their region for fuel cell vehicles and trucks by having that kind of upsizing their behind the fence fleet capacity, and then providing a public facing nozzle. And I think SMUD used to do that with CNG and some other things. And so there's opportunities there with the utility fleets, which I think those bigger class 4 through 6 boom trucks are kind of a good place for hydrogen deployment. And it might be an opportunity within the publicly owned utilities to move in that direction, but also cities and counties that have these road maintenance fleets and things like that. I think there's an opportunity for additional public-private partnership, and we'd absolutely be open for that conversation.
We have a question from Matthew Schrapp. 500 days, what efforts are underway to streamline/shorten permitting timelines?
It's a good question. So we've introduced legislation this year. I believe the bill is 1291. Senator Archuleta introduced this. It's a kind of a passion piece for him. And he was kind of pushing us to move a little bit faster on that. The Fuel Cell Partnership did develop or worked with GoBiz, and I believe GoBiz has a permitting handbook. And I know that our sister organization, the California Hydrogen Business Council, is working on some issues along those lines. We did see kind of amendments to the McCarty bill last year, which expedited permitting for charging, but he wasn't willing to to include hydrogen refueling stations into that piece. And so I think we're doing a lot of that outreach and work right now. And then Senator Archuleta's 1291 could always use additional supporters and examples of that. But yeah, we really want to truncate the timing that it takes to get the station online. GFO, the grant funding opportunities that the CEC presents, it provides us 18 months to get permitting. And so while we're able to get most of them in and under that time, there are stations that we have to go back and seek extensions on our funding on receiving the funding, because we're having issues with getting that permitted. And so to the extent that you want to help, SB 1291 is a good place to lend support. But also, if there's any cities and counties that want to learn more, we're more than willing to have a conversation. Nico and I can team up, and we've got technical experts on staff that can help you guys figure out maybe if there's a better checklist or something along those lines.
So we have a question from Will Ritter. Is the state pursuing funding under the $8 billion identified in the bipartisan infrastructure bill to support the development of at least 4 clean hydrogen hubs across the United States? And if so, what is that strategy and partnership opportunities across the private and public sector?
It's a good question. So the Select Committee on Hydrogen had a informational hearing, I believe it was last week, on the hubs. The Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development is very involved, and they've been designated as the, the Department of Energy asked for one person within the state, and so GoBiz, I believe it's Tyson at GoBiz, was designated kind of our hub liaison for the state of California, and they're starting to they're having conversations with the various groups that are developing hubs, and have sent direction out to most of the hydrogen community in that regard on what they'd like to see. And I think right now the direction from, and they're still developing their idea around this, but there's a lot of, High Deal is one example, which is a kind of a California, Utah power-based hydrogen production for the electricity grid. You have Alta-C that's looking at doing a port-based, Port of Los Angeles, Long Beach based hub. Sunline Transit has their own plans. I believe Northern California Power Authority is also working at it, and it's going to be GoBiz's, the Governor's Office of Business and Economics Development's job to kind of marry all of these proposals and put them together. I'll say that the California Hydrogen Coalition is putting together kind of a drop-in piece that could leverage the state dollars that have been budgeted and unallocated towards a hydrogen hub for transportation. We believe that there's sufficient state dollars today that we could build the necessary statewide network for both the the lighter medium duty vehicles and the heavy duty and medium duty trucks with the state funds, and we can just add that in to make sure that we have a comprehensive piece that's attractive to one of those 4 hubs. And I think there's an opportunity here to create the first self-sufficient zero-emission vehicle technology in the world in California if we get this hub project landed right.
Okay, thank you, Mikael. I really appreciate you and Nico presenting today, and I'm gonna end this call because I know we're after time. But if anyone else has questions as follow-up, we'll go ahead and Sherry, can you put Mikael's email in the chat and just leave it there for a few minutes in case people want to reach out to him?
Sure, I'll do that right now.
Okay, thank you, Mikael, and we'll go ahead and end this meeting now. So thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we will talk to you. I believe our next work group meeting is May 13th, so we'll talk to you then.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.